My name is Graham Lynch. I'm the Dissemination and Communication Officer for the Horizon 2020 funded GRRIP project. GRRIP is focused on embedding sustainable, responsible research and innovation practices in 4 research performing organisations and 1 dual function research performing and research funding organisation in the marine and maritime sectors to achieve institutional change. The project is focused on 6 dimensions of responsible research and innovation: ethics, science education, open access and data, public engagement, gender equality, and governance. This group organised event features a presentation by Dr. Andrew Adams on the topic of opening up research and innovation. The session will cover a number of salient themes regarding open data, open access, open science, open knowledge, and open innovation, all within the remit of responsible research and innovation. The GRRIP project is delighted to have Dr. Adams agree to be here with us to present. Dr. Adams is eminently qualified to shed some light and share knowledge on the topic of open research and innovation. He is the Deputy Director of the Centre for Business Information Ethics at Meiji University in Tokyo. He's a BSc in Mathematics and Computational Science and a Master's degree in Computer Science from the University of Leeds, a PhD in Computer Science from the University of St Andrews, and a Master's in Law in Advanced Legal Studies from the University of Reading. He is a multidisciplinary researcher looking at social, legal, and ethical aspects of computer and communication technologies. His expertise is in privacy and data protection, security, e-learning, copyright, and freedom of speech. He has been a prominent open science activist for 20 years. In this session, Dr. Adams will present the philosophical and practical case for opening up research and innovation. He will explain what open means with regards to papers, data, science, innovation, and knowledge, and he will explain why researchers and innovators should care to make their work open.
Okay, so just before we get going in the meat of today, just a quick couple of acknowledgements. I'm a member of staff at Meiji University in Tokyo. I'm the Deputy Director of the Centre for Business Information Ethics. As Gordon introduced, we were a partner in the Horizon 2020 Ring project, which was relatively unusual for Horizon 2020 projects in having non-EU partners, although not that unusual. We're currently a partner in the EU-Japan.ai project as well. And of course, I'm giving this talk on behalf of the GRRIP project, one of the follow-up projects to Ring, effectively. So I'm going to start with a bit of historic context to where we are now with open access. And I'm going to go through how we got to where we are. And while I think many of you are authors of academic peer-reviewed papers, but not necessarily all of you, you may not have looked back into how we got to where we are with the current system of sharing knowledge among researchers. So if we go back a few hundred years, the first formal arrangements for sharing academic outcomes in Western Europe really is the UK's Royal Society, based in London. And they created a proceedings of their mutual talks presenting their latest results. Other societies, similar societies at about the same time, were springing up in many of the major European capitals at the time, and there was quite a lot of interchange, even back then, between these organizations, and they started sharing these proceedings of the presentations between each other. First, just informally, people who had copies would share copies or send them to friends of theirs in the other societies. And then more formally, as these societies created direct avenues for just automatically sending a copy of their proceedings to each other. So we see that this is small groups individually sharing their outcomes and putting them in formal written formats, and then gradually sharing these to a broader audience. Now, one of the issues about this broadening out was that some of what was being presented in some of these societies was not necessarily of the highest quality. And as we move through into the 19th and then the 20th centuries, there was a problem in that science was growing. It was getting much bigger. Many more people were getting engaged in this through many more societies on specific topics such as chemistry or physics or biology. And it became impossible for one person to be a Renaissance person anymore, and to follow everything that was going on. And in order to be able to limit themselves to reading only the best material and to try and limit stuff which was poorly designed experiments or poorly carried out experiments, the idea of the concept of peer review came up. That is that your peers, those who are equally well qualified in your particular subject matter, have a look at what you're doing, give you feedback on whether it's understandable, whether there are any flaws in it, whether there are errors in either the process or the interpretation of the outcomes. And they became quality control for what was going into these shared publications. Now, as we move into the 20th century, as universities became more formalized institutions, and as the status of people's publications rose and became linked to their prestige in other ways, particularly within their own university or other research-oriented institution, but also within their field, the linkage of authorship primarily, but also editorship of the proceedings, the new journals in these areas, and the counting of how many people referred to your work, citations, became standard prestige measures in academic research circles. Now, that in itself is not necessarily a problem, although we can always talk about the issues that any indirect measure of prestige can raise. But the problem comes really when commercial interests start getting involved in this situation. Now, as I said, the original publishers of these scholarly proceedings and journals were scholarly societies or research institutions themselves. Now, they would, after the initial peer sharing of these societies became too large for them to cope with, they started charging subscription payments to cover the costs of printing and distribution. It was not intended in the early days to be a method of raising extra funds for the societies. But we'll come back to the scholarly societies a little later on, and how it has to some extent now become a money-raising stream of revenue rather than simply cost covering. Now, authors were not paid for their work. Authors have never been paid for their work in these scholarly journals and proceedings. The idea was that they sought the prestige of being published in them. So almost uniquely in any form of modern publishing, the authors are not receiving direct monetary payments. Now, as the increase in the number of institutions that were wanting to get to subscribe to these journals came about, the problems for the scholarly societies or the research institutions was that this became a burdensome extra work that they were doing that wasn't part of their core mission. So most of these societies were not set up primarily to be publishers. Some of them embraced that, as I say, we'll talk about that again a little later. Some of them embraced that and became, to a certain extent, a major publishing house. But many of them, particularly those which were small societies or which were research institutions where they had been publishing a journal in one particular field, were finding that this maintenance of the administration of these journals and the administration of these subscription payments was becoming quite burdensome, and it wasn't part of what they were interested in doing. And at the same time, commercial publishers were being created in various fields, and some existing commercial publishers bought into the academic journal market, approaching existing scholarly societies or institutions to buy out their existing journals. And there are various still, in some cases, over 100-year-old contracts which cover the transfer of the right to publish a particular journal from a society or institution over to a commercial publisher. It's partly why it's such a varied field. If you look through the details of these, you'll find that even one publisher can have many, many different setups for different journals. Some of those journals they set up themselves, some of them have been inherited from other commercial publishers they bought, and others they themselves have got from scholarly societies or research institutions. So commercial organizations provided a centralization of these administration services. And gradually, in many fields, they gained control of the most prestigious titles, because the most prestigious titles are the ones which have the highest number of subscribers. The best journals have the most subscribers and are therefore most of interest to the commercial publishers to gain them. Now, a quick side move briefly into the question of how the law sits. So we've talked about the science, we've talked about the administration and the beginnings of the commercial interest in this. Now we need to briefly talk about how copyright relates to this. Now, most scholarly authors, unlike other people who will do writing of some form as part of their job, most scholarly authors, particularly in universities, will own the copyright in their work. It's been long been part of the arrangements that scholars had with universities and many other types of research institutions, that they own the copyrights in what they produce. There are a few cases where this isn't the case. If you're a US government employee, and there are those in US government employment who write scholarly papers, particularly in things like NIST, the US Standards Institution, and in some other technical areas as well. And industrial researchers often do not technically own the copyright. Now, in the paper era, so before really the early 80s, many of the publications requested the authors sign over their copyright to the journal as a way to just ease legal friction. And because most of the authors had no particular interest in making, and in fact, no opportunity to make any other use of the specific work, and because publishers didn't often exert all of the technical rights that copyright transfer would give them, there was this accepted tacit arrangement between academic authors and these publishers of academic works that, yes, the copyright would be transferred, but that would not be exploited to its full extent by these commercial publishers. Certainly not in the same way that it would be in, for example, books, even academic textbooks, and certainly not in the way that non-academic, non-fiction, or indeed fiction would be applied. And in the 70s, 60s, as photocopiers became widespread, lots of people would photocopy papers. It was accepted practice that people would photocopy papers held by their library, held individually. And when I was a PhD student myself in the early 90s, early to mid 90s, every academic then had at least a filing cabinet full of photocopies of papers that they were either photocopied from their own library or had been passed on, perhaps as photocopies of photocopies, from the authors or just from other academics who had a particular paper that they wished to access. Now, this was not something that the publishers really made an effort about in the 70s and the 80s. But by the in the 60s and the 70s, but by the 80s, publishers started exerting some of these more technical rights. And by the late 90s, there was a significant change in university libraries. I remember this because it happened while I was transitioning from a PhD student to a postdoc, was that suddenly you had to fill in a form if you photocopied a paper from an academic journal, or if you copied a chapter from an academic textbook in the university library. And that hadn't been the case when I was an undergraduate or a PhD student, but suddenly it was the case that you had to fill this in, and that the university libraries would have to report which bits were being copied. There were limits, supposedly. I think most people were not really trying to pay attention to these limits, although supposedly you were not supposed, for example, to copy all of the papers in a particular issue of a journal, or more than 1/10 of a particular book. And if it was a special issue of a journal on your particular topic, this could be quite irritating. And at the same time, right from the 70s and through into the 80s and the 90s, the price of these journals was going up, and the costs of getting an approved formal copy, even of one paper, was gradually rising. Plus, at the same time, as well as the cost for subscribing or getting a single issue or a single paper on an authorized copy going up, the number of papers being published and the number of journals made available was steadily increasing, well above the budgets of the university libraries. And that I'll come to that in more detail in a moment. But the other aspects of copyright here, again, historically, everybody assumed that authors themselves would distribute copies of their papers. For many journals, you would receive a set of off-prints, far more than, say, the author of a book would receive. Authors of books will typically receive somewhere between 6 or 15 copies of a book for their own use. Papers were often much more than that. Many journals would offer 50 copies to each author. And it was accepted that once you'd run out of these individually bound copies, that you would provide people with photocopies of the copy you happen to have. Rights for authors started being limited. Some of the contracts would not exempt the author themselves from providing people with photocopies of their work. And the reuse of content, which until the 80s really had been regarded as a matter of publication ethics in academia, and that reusing somebody's content, we reuse other people's content all the time. It's part of the training of a researcher, is how to reuse content in the appropriate academic way. Copying from one source is plagiarism. Copying from multiple sources with attribution is a key part of research. But let me give you an example from my own work. Not long after I started working with people in Japan, before I moved here, we produced a paper about privacy in Japan. And in that paper, I generated a diagram to demonstrate one of the key issues that we were talking about. One of my co-authors then wanted to reuse that same diagram in a further paper of theirs, expanding on the same ideas. And of course, they were quite happy to give credit. They would reference the joint paper we had done, and they were going to credit me for using the image. But as well as asking me if they could reuse that image in a new paper, In fact, asking me if they could reuse the image in the paper was technically, in a legal sense, a courtesy. It wasn't something they actually had to do. What they actually had to do, and this was enforced by the publisher of the new paper, was that they had to get written permission from the publisher of the earlier paper, to whom I had transferred the copyright. We had transferred the copyright in the paper, and that included me transferring the copyright to the image to this publisher. And so we had to get formal permission from them to reuse an image from our own work. This would be just the same had I wanted to use it as the creator of the image. And in some fields of research, images are quite difficult to generate. They require a lot of work. This one was simply some work in a standard graphics package presenting a graphical version of an idea. But in some fields, it is an awful lot of work to produce a graphical representation, a visualization of some of the data and some of the concepts in a paper. And yet the expectation by the publishers has been for a long time that you would transfer all that to them. Now, it must be said, in most cases, for academic reuse, they will not expect to be paid by the new publisher for that. And I have actually not heard of anybody having the permission refused to reuse work. And I have, in fact, myself reused someone else's graphics in further paper. But again, I had to go, as a courtesy, I went to the original author. But as a matter of technical legal requirements, I had to go to the publisher of the paper in which that was first published. Now, in some fields, as I mentioned earlier, some academic societies have became and have remained very strong publishers. In my own field of computing and related fields of electrical engineering, electronic engineering, the ACM, the Association of Computing Machinery, and the IEEE are some of the biggest publishers in the area. And they get substantial subscription income and income for accessing a single paper. Now, over the last 10 years or so, that's become something of a controversy within those organizations. These are membership-driven organizations, and people like me, I'm a member of both organizations, and in fact, I'm on the Plagiarism and Ethics, Publication Ethics Committee of the ACM. We have been pushing these societies to make the material that they publish open access for a number of reasons that I'll talk about later on in this talk today. But it's been a very hard and long discussion we've had within these organizations, and they are finally moving, but it's still slow. The ACM is currently partway through a 5-year plan to move to open access for the vast majority of its publications. But that's taken over 10 years of advocacy within the organization by people like myself and other open access advocates to get us to that point. And on the other side, as a volunteer running smaller special interest groups within these organizations, as the chair for a few years of the Special Interest Group on Computers and Society, a significant chunk of the income of that special interest group was from our income via the publication subscription route through the organization. And we've had to balance the needs of not undermining the very good work that these scholarly societies do by forcing them too quickly and unsustainably to wean themselves off this subscription income. And what they're replacing it with, I'll talk about a little later, which is primarily author processing charges, but not only that. So, open access is in many ways an attempt to do two things: to return to a more easygoing way of accessing this academic, these academic outputs, but also to deal with the fact that it's no longer limited by the physical distribution of these artifacts as either photocopies or printed items. Now, by the 70s, you can see, if you look through the academic literature on science itself, you can see a number of articles talking about the growing serials crisis, or sometimes called the journals crisis, sometimes referred to as the library budget crisis. Now, as I say, this was driven by a number of factors, one of which was the massive growth of science and other scholarly activity areas around the world, the mass growth of the number of people publishing work, and the fact that in order to have access to all of this, libraries had to subscribe to ever more journals whose price was even then going up in excess of inflation. And this was leading to a budget crisis for libraries and their subscriptions. And right back to 73, 74, we see reports that libraries were beginning to cull their subscriptions. They were no longer expanding their subscriptions according to whatever the scholars would request them to subscribe to. They were beginning to retrench back, and they were beginning to say, are people reading this? They were beginning to surveil what people were reading, not because they wanted to control what they were reading, but just because they needed to know, is anybody in this university, in this institution, reading this thing that we're paying a large amounts of money to the publisher to have? Now, even in the early 70s, people were saying, well, this is all to do with the physical distribution of these journals. And if we can simply transfer these documents onto electronic form, as was the promise of the early computer networks, then we should be able to solve this problem. So even in the 70s, people were saying, yeah, okay, it's a problem, but hopefully it will be a short-term problem. They could see the promise of these new computer networks, that soon we wouldn't have to go through the physical distribution, and that these things could be distributed electronically at effectively zero cost once you paid the infrastructure cost of maintaining the computer networks. However, the people who were controlling these journals were commercial publishers. And like most large commercial entities, they were very risk averse, but they were also very self-interested and could see that moving to an electronic distribution would undermine their justification for charging the high prices that they could do. Now, in the 80s, in a few fields, the academics themselves started sharing electronic forms of the new literature that they were generating. So they didn't really try and do this for previous literature, but particularly in areas like computer science and areas of physics and mathematics, where people were typesetting their papers electronically all the way through. At this point, many of the people in other fields were still handwriting or typing or having somebody type up the papers which they submitted to journals. Whereas in computing, certainly high energy physics, particle physics, and many other areas of mathematics, where people did learn how to use the computers very early on, and were using the new tools such as TeX and LaTeX to generate their papers. They were creating PostScript files from these. Younger people in this may not know very well what PostScript is. PostScript is what we had before PDF. It basically serves the same purpose, but it was just not as good a format. So these papers were being created as PostScript files, and they were being shared in computer science, primarily on FTP, file transfer protocol sites. By the mid to late 80s, many of the computer science departments certainly in the industrialized world, were on computer networks with each other. Typically in America, it was the internet. In other countries, they would have their own national ones, which had some interconnections with the internet. When I was an undergrad in the late 80s, for example, we were using JANET, the UK's joint academic network that allowed us access to the whole of the UK. And there was a small service offered by a London university that could allow us to access sites on the internet, primarily American at that point. FTP is a protocol that allows you to download individual files from a remote directory store. And computer science were making their papers available for anyone to download who knew where they were and could access the files. Now, it wasn't that easy to gain access to them. The web, in fact, one of the main reasons for the creation of the web was to replace the difficult process of accessing things via the FTP sites, which is like accessing one of the early text-only computers and accessing all your files directly from the command line. The web was basically FTP and other services, but with a modern graphical implementation, graphical front end, as people were using for accessing their own local files as well by that time. So in computer science, they were using things on FTP sites. Particle physics had groups beginning to share, particularly their preprints, via email lists. Now, this is an interesting difference between computing and physics at this point, in that the particle physics community were primarily sharing preprints before they were submitted to journals. They would also often share the final version with the same group of people. But what they were interested in was collaborating with each other and having people check their work before it was submitted to journals. Whereas in computer science, now, and I think the reason for this, as a computer scientist myself, was the speed with which computer science moved in the 80s and the 90s. There was a very strong desire to share very up-to-date materials in computer science, because if you waited a year, it would be out of date. So there was a desire to make things, the up-to-the-minute material, available as quickly and as broadly as possible within computer science. But it was mostly the already published material that we were interested in sharing there, whereas physics was interested in a more organic pre-publication discussion of the contents of the papers and sharing of them in a pre-final form. Now, they were regarded by the academics who were doing it as the same as the offprints that they had long been engaged in sharing via photocopies or having a physical copy of things. And the commercial publishers mostly ignored this. Partly, I think, in computer science, it was because the commercial publishers were the scholarly societies, and they were made up primarily of the people doing the sharing. And so I've not talked to anyone who was involved in the publishing at that point, but I get the feeling that even if it came to their notice, they would have felt, we're making enough money out of this anyway. We don't need to be bullies about our technical copyrights. And if we try, we're simply attacking our own members. And that's never going to bode well, either for elected volunteer positions like the head of publications board, nor for the employed staff, their secretariats. Some related fields such as cognitive science, which is a sort of halfway house really between computing and psychology, picked up these habits from the computer science side of their work, and many other areas of computational work, such as computational linguistics, which included strong collaborations with computer scientists, began to pick up these areas of sharing their work through the FTP sites. Now, in 1991, just before the web was generated, the central archive for HE physics was created to replace the growth of the email lists that had become completely unwieldy to operate. When they started, there were maybe tens or a few hundreds of people who signed up to receive every preprint sent to their email inbox. By the early 90s, particle physics, even as a subfield, had grown to the point where you just couldn't keep up with the number of emails that would be coming in to your system, and they needed a more centralized system. And so the archive was created as a central repository where anyone could go and find these papers. So what you have here is, sorry, on the wrong window, we have two competing models of this early attempt to do peer-to-peer open access. We had the subject level sharing of physics and the archive versus the institutional sharing of computer science. Now, computer science, although institutionally based, was, as you might expect, being computer scientists, they made use of the overlay technologies, the early search engines, the pre-web search engines, which did exist, which would allow you to find the copies of the papers you were interested in on the FTP site that they were located, that was hosting them. Now, in the early 90s, Adobe created PDF, an easier format to share than PostScript, which gradually through the 90s became the dominant format. This led to continued pressure on the publishers to adopt electronic distribution of papers. Apart from anything else, by this point, not just the financial constraints on libraries were becoming an issue, but the physical constraints on libraries of the growing number of journals that they were expected to subscribe to and keep available was placing pressure on universities. You know, not only were they being constantly pressured to subscribe to journals with over inflation increases in subscription prices every year, but also they had to keep all of the back catalogue and make them available. So the pressure for electronic distribution was coming from the academics themselves. People were starting to say, why do I keep needing to photocopy these things? Plus, the libraries were saying, it's getting really awkward to subscribe to all of these journals that people want to access. And really, we've looked at this, you know, and in any particular issue of any particular journal, maybe 3 people will read 3 or 4 different papers. And yet we subscribe and physically store 20, 50, 100 papers in a year's output, just so that people can have access to the 3 or 4 that they need at that point. Now, in the pre-electronic age, that's what you needed to do. You didn't know ahead of time what those 3 or 4 papers were going to be. In order to have all of them available, you had to have a full subscription. But by the early 90s, when it was clear that the technology to make these available to a select portion, in the early 90s, this was still a select portion of academia worldwide who definitely had access to these. But there was a pressure from librarians who were saying, look, we would really like to be able to train people to use the computers in the library. You know, yes, the computer scientists and the mathematicians and the physicists and some others all use computers in their labs and their offices these days. Not everybody does, but they use the electronic catalogues in our library to find out where these physical journal articles are and which journal articles they are interested in looking at. It would be really nice if we could train them to just be able to download and then print out or read on screen the papers themselves, the individual ones they're interested in. But the academic publishers were very reluctant, as in all of the areas of publishing, were very reluctant to adopt an electronic means of distribution, because they could see that once things were available electronically, they were losing their gatekeeping model, which made them very high profits, very high profit margins. Now, in 1994, this is really the start of what you might think of as formally the open access movement. The things which went before were just bubbling up grassroots development of open access. In 1994, a cognitive scientist called Stephen Harnad at Southampton University in the UK made what he called the subversive proposal. Now, his proposal was not just about open access, it was actually related to the sorts of things that had been going on in physics. And he was very heavily informed by what had gone on with the archive and the earlier mailing lists, and the use of discussion before a paper was even submitted to a journal to improve the outcomes of that work, and to continue improving on that work afterwards so that people could comment on and make small scale amendments to their own work or even to other people's work. But in particular, the only way you could do that was if everybody could read everything that was available, and not be limited by what their particular institution had a subscription to. So amongst other improvements to academic communications, some of which have been adopted in the last 25 years, many of which haven't, was the idea that if we moved to electronic publishing, we should be able to remove most, if not all, of the subscription costs for reading the papers. 7 years after Stephen made his groundbreaking subversive proposal, a bunch of academics, librarians, and finance officers gathered in Budapest to debate the continuing now for almost 30 years journals crisis, and what academics were going to do about improving the academic communication, in particular, improving the situation that more and more academics were not able to gain easy, or in some cases at all, access to the material that other people have produced for them to continue doing their work. So the Budapest proposal coined the term open access and described two main methods for achieving this. The self-archiving one, which can either be done on a subject level, based on the physics model of the archive, or the institutional level, based on the computer science idea of your own hosting. And these were marked as the green road to open access. That basically, when you publish a paper, you yourself as the author and your institution, either through a subject archive or through your own institutional archive, should make available the text. Now, there was a big debate at the time as to how to make sure that this was accepted by the publishers. I word to use accepted, not acceptable, because to the publishers, nothing is acceptable except retaining their both control, but particularly their income streams, but pushing it so that it was accepted by the publishers. And one of the things that was accepted by the academics was that what matters in most cases is the text. What we want when we read other people's academic work is primarily the text and the graphics. The layout, which is one of the few things that the academic publishers actually provide for us, is secondary. Now, yes, if you're then going to use a particular quote and you need in your field to specify page numbers, etc., you're going to need access to the publisher layout. But the main one was that you need access to the text. And in particular, if you can gain access to the text of any paper that you think, oh, that looks interesting, I wonder, I might have a look at that and see, is it worth reading? Is it worth digesting? Is it worth then using and citing? And only when you come to the point of saying, yes, I'm going to publish a paper on this, oh, I need to see the original version and make sure I'm getting this quote as it was in the final published version and give line numbers or page numbers or whatever it is, then it's worth paying for the particular off-print of that. But until then, until you need it at that level of detail, what you need is the text. So the green road to open access is all about having access to the basic text, the basic core information that one author is trying to transmit to their readers. Now, the other way of achieving open access is for journals themselves to make the work available. That's referred to as the gold open access. I came into this movement a little later than that, a couple of years after it, and I actually feel it was a slightly awkward terminology that they used. Green and gold, not quite the same things. And the trouble with gold is that it's too related to money. And it's actually become the gold-plated road to open access, as I'll talk about in a few minutes. Now, we still haven't achieved open access. This is now over 25 years since Harnad's subversive proposal. It's over 20 years now since the Budapest proposal, coining the Budapest Declaration coined the term open access. We still haven't reached it. I still find that there are papers that I can't access that I would be interested in seeing whether I want to read. And this is the frustrating thing for me, is I can't even know that I want to read it until I can delve into more than I can see online. I need to be able to read the introduction to see whether I need to read the rest of the paper. And yet, for many of the papers that my university doesn't subscribe to the journal for, it's $35 or more for an individual paper. And I am a voracious reader, as many academics are. Particularly, I have the advantage, as far as I'm concerned, but the disadvantage in this area of being a highly interdisciplinary researcher. The problem with this is that this means that myself and my colleagues in the Centre for Business Information Ethics, we cover work including psychology, computer science, economics, history, the science of science, the history of science, the philosophy of science, philosophy, ethics. I've done work on medicine. I've done work on education. There are, so far as I'm aware, almost no other researchers in my university who specialise, amongst other things for me, in distance education issues. Therefore, my university does not subscribe to distance education journals. And therefore, we don't gain any economies of scale from a subscription to them. And if I want to read or consider reading a particular distance education journal paper, I've got to decide, without seeing anything more than the abstract, is this individual paper worth $35 or more? Unless it's available open access. Yeah. Now, we haven't achieved open access, but people being as they are, there are other issues that people started talking about as well. Now, Stephen, who is a longtime friend of mine in this area, when I first entered this area, I found Stephen a font of knowledge on this and became quite good friends with him. One of Stephen's constant refrains, particularly in the early part of this, in the 2010, was to try and say to people, stop trying to do everything. Can we fix open access first and then move on to the other things? But people being people, they couldn't keep the focus on solving the biggest first problem. And lots of people started saying, well, if and when we get open access, or even just now still, we need more. We want more. And for very good reasons related to concepts of open science and the ethics of science, people started saying we also need access not just to the papers, but to the data behind the research. Okay, so just a quick wrap up now of what open access is and what we mean when we talk about open data. So open access is about making the text of your published academic papers freely available for others to read. Now, this primarily covers academic articles. It may include book chapters, but they are a more tricky issue. For example, I am a big, as you might have gathered, I'm a big proponent of open access, but I don't make my book chapter contributions as available as I do my journal papers and conference papers. I do make them available to people, but basically I do it on slightly on the QT. I put them into different places like my own webpage and the different online databases. And if anyone asks me for a copy, I will send them one. But I don't make the book chapters available because it's a different business model and it's a more thorny issue. It includes the text, the tables and the graphics, but it doesn't include the journal layout pagination, depending on what the publisher allows. If the publisher allows it, by all means, distribute that, their PDF. But if not, it matters. Giving people a text, tables and graphics matters. If you ask somebody, and we did during the Ring project, what they would like, if they would like a copy of the text, even if they couldn't get the full journal layout, or to have to pay to see whether they need it, they generally, once they understood what we were asking, would say, oh yeah, of course I want the text. If I can't get the publisher one without paying large amounts of money, yes, I will make do with just the text. And it only covers what you already publish as an academic author without being paid. So nobody is trying to say that if you also write textbooks, as I have myself, or that if you write research monographs for which you get paid royalties, nobody's saying that those should be automatically made open access as well. Now, my own feeling is that if I ever do write another textbook, I will be doing so on an open access basis. But that's down to me. The reason I went with non-open access for the first textbook was I wanted to get the book out there, and at the time there were very few options for open access textbooks. These days there are options, and I would go that route, but I'm not trying to impose that on any of my colleagues. If you want to go with a commercial publisher for a textbook, that's perfectly reasonable, but you're not getting paid for your journal articles anyway. The only people you're helping by restricting access is the commercial publishers, who make at the moment very large amounts of money out of it. Now, open data is making your source data freely available in a useful form for other researchers to build on. Now, this is more thorny, and if you're interested in the details of this, I recommend you look at the RRI deliverables, where we did go through this in some great detail. There are concerns about data, multitudes of concerns. There are very many ones. If your data is about people or is in some way linked to people, then you've got to take care of those people's privacy. If you gather data and you publish some work based on a small portion of it, you may need to publish the whole data if you're going to make it useful to others, but you may not have finished mining that data for your own outputs, and you may worry about being scooped by other people analyzing your data, which you don't get at the moment. You don't get credit generally for generating data. In academia, you get credit generally for publishing papers in top-ranked journals, and not for developing the data which other people then use to publish in top-ranked journals. There are growing ethical approaches to this as to at what point you have to approach somebody and say, I'd like to do this analysis of your data. Would you like to collaborate with me since you were the one who generated the data? How much effort you put into generating the data and how much that is worth in terms of credit is still something academia is struggling with. These are the issues amongst plagiarism complaints that I deal with in the ACM committee I mentioned earlier. And these are thorny issues that we do not have hard and fast rules on yet, so they're emerging areas. Your funding contracts may require open access to papers published as a result of your work, and they may require open data. At the moment, open data mandates are generally quite weak and are on a best effort basis. And even with the best will and with experts in it, if you look, RRI produced open data for some of the things we did. And Indrani and Gordon and I and a few of our colleagues spent quite a lot of time right at the end of the project trying to figure out what we could get, what we could make available, how it needed to be anonymized, because a lot of our work was survey results and interview results. It was quite a lot of work to make that data open. And, you know, it was part of the contract that we signed with the Commission, so we were happy to do it. But for those who are not given credit for it and whose research contracts don't mandate it, it can be a big task and an unpaid task for many people. And it's often, unfortunately, due to the power relationships within academia, it's often the junior and less privileged people in academia who get given these jobs, and it takes away from their opportunity to work on the more prestigious things. It will be given to the junior person, it will be given to the female researcher, it will be given to the researcher from an ethnic minority, it will be given to the researcher on a precarious contract. All of those power relationships play into this, and that's one of the issues that we work on when we look about the ethics of opening data, is to make sure that we're not exacerbating power inequalities that exist already. But why haven't we gone further on this? Well, money and politics, and to some extent the methods. Prestige is a big issue. If you want to get a chair at a major university, In many fields, the easiest and simplest way to do it is to have 1 or 2 papers published in Nature or Science. There are many fields in which you get an early paper published in Science or Nature, and you're pretty much guaranteed the fast track to a chair. Because of this, journals such as Science and Nature and the top-ranked journals in their fields are high competition to get into. And the publishers of those know that they can charge very high subscription rates for them because of the associated prestige. All of this flows out of academia. Academics do the vast majority of the editing work, most of it unpaid. We do almost all of the reviewing work, unpaid. And yet the publishers sit there and take the profits on this and then deny people access to the work. It's very frustrating. As an open access evangelist for 20 years, it's very frustrating seeing this. And the lobbying of governments, of funding agencies, and of institutions, research institutions, universities, has been disheartening at times to see how successful it is. There's also a lot of historical institutionalism. There is still a resistance to moving to electronic publication in many fields. And we saw this in the empirical outputs from Ring, that people still worry about the prestige of new, particularly open access journals, and that they have all delayed our movement to open access. It's the arc of history in this area is tending towards openness, but we're not there yet. The existing publishers, both commercials and non-profits, have often pushed author payments as the replacement, but there are many problems with this approach. We're replacing a charge to read with a charge to publish, which means that people who don't have research grants, people who are publishing from a non-institutional background, people who don't hold their own research grants, and people in particular from underdeveloped economies, are going to have a problem. Now, these people often have an existing problem in accessing the existing literature, but if we're just replacing the problem they have of reading the literature, which is a necessary precursor to writing, with a bar to writing, we're not getting anywhere for them. Maybe they can do enormously important work, but they can't afford to publish it. So again, we run the risk, particularly of pushing author payments as the solution, of regenerating, or even in some cases worsening, the existing barriers. For instance, at the moment, if you're a junior researcher at a university, you have the same level of access almost, certainly to everything that your university subscribes to, as your top professors. They might have money to buy things, buy access to papers that they don't have a subscription to and don't care about that. But that's a marginal difference. But if you replace that with everything is free to read, but you have to find somebody to pay thousands of dollars, and this is what we're talking about, in order to get published in a prestige journal, because the prestige matters, and the prestige journals will charge more because they can. Not because it costs them any more, but because they can. Because people want to publish in them, and therefore they will pay more. And it's very clear that it's not to do with the costs. The commercial publishers are not cost covering. They are milking the market for what it will bear. In particular, Stephen Harned warned right back in 2001 about fool's gold, paying author processing charges in gold journals, or for individual papers in what I've referred to as hybrid journals, where some of the papers are open access and some are not, without the prices coming down. Stephen was very foresighted in this. He said, this is what will happen if we do the gold route to open access without getting the green route done first. And he's been right. As we've failed to get the green route adopted near universally, gold has come in and we've been chasing fool's gold. We've also created an extra rod for our own back. When I was a PhD student, predatory journals basically didn't exist. There was no such thing as a predatory journal. Yes, there were journals, there weren't junk journals, but there were journals with lower levels of prestige. But you quickly got the idea of which ones were very high quality and which ones were lower quality ones. But there was no such thing really as junk journals when I was a PhD student. In the last 20 years, the rise of author payments as opposed to reader payments has led to the development of predatory journals, also predatory conferences. And this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. And it's something we as academics need to pay attention to. Being aware of it is not enough. I have actually been the co-author of a paper in a predatory journal. I was the co-author with a PhD student, and the PhD student found what she thought was a perfectly reasonable place to put some of our work. It was open access, and one of the things I'd always stressed to her was that we should, where possible, make our work open access. So she applied to the university, which by that point was my old university in the UK, not my one in Japan, for some funding to pay the charge. After we published it, somebody pointed out to us, I'm not sure that this is really a journal you probably should have been publishing in. And so we looked it up, and yes, it's listed as a predatory journal that basically does no real peer review. It claims to do so. It will take your money and publish junk. It's disappointing because although it's not really groundbreaking work, it is solid work. And I was particularly disappointed on behalf of the PhD student. She's the first author on this. And I felt the failure as a supervisor because I hadn't made her aware of this early enough to make sure that she checked these things. But it can be impossible to check. There used to be a list of potentially predatory publishers produced by a very brave academic called Geoffrey Beale. But eventually, after many attacks on himself and his institution, he's taken it down. And nobody has stepped up to replace this. I've talked to people in the open access field and the scholarly publishing field that we need an institutional backer for this, and we need a committee to deal with this, but nobody stepped forward to do it. Self-archiving works, but it requires a mass movement. It requires everybody from the authors, but also their institutions and particularly their librarians to provide the support. It's disappointing that librarians haven't realized that their role is no longer curating access on the incoming side, and their role is best transformed in the research area to promoting access on the outgoing side. And I've had many conversations with librarians over the years, and it's very difficult for them to make this sort of shift in their viewpoints. And often they are placing barriers in the way of self-archiving. I worked very hard at the University of Reading before I moved to Japan to get a good mandate for self-archiving there. And I succeeded on one strand. So just before I left, they adopted a self-archiving mandate. I failed on the other side, though, because the barriers to doing the self-archiving were too high. You had to provide all the minute details of the publication. You had to get formal permission and check with the publisher. There are all sorts of barriers in the way. They wouldn't allow you to put preprints on there. They wouldn't allow you to put things in there which didn't have an ISSN or an ISBN. If you published a paper in a minor conference proceedings, they would block you publishing it in there. That was a failure. I worked very hard over about 8 years trying to persuade them of this, and I only partially succeeded. These persistent misunderstandings, partly driven by fear, uncertainty, and doubt from the publishers of the roles of intermediaries in academic communication, persist. This happens everywhere in the content industries, the intermediary industries. It's happened in music, in movies, in TV, and it still persists in academic publishing. We see that particularly from the Ring empirical work, that people still don't understand how these systems work. They, quite reasonably, most people are focused on doing their own research, publishing their work, and they don't want to get into these minutiae, which means we need people in the institutions. In particular, we need librarians and we need research management to understand these things and to push them in the right way. Now, funding agencies are the elephants in the room. They're the biggest beasts. They're slow to move. It's taken very long time and a very, very large amounts of lobbying by people on the open access side, counter lobbied by the commercial publishers. Many of them are moving in the right direction, but they've been seduced by the fool's gold. And I keep telling people, don't waste your academic research funds on paying for open access, particularly in hybrid journals. Stick the paper in on ResearchGate or academia.edu, stick it in your institutional repository. If you don't have one, press your institution to have one. If the publisher says you can't release it for 6 months or a year or 2 years or even 5 years, fine, stick it in the database, put all the details in there. These systems have a way that people can ask you privately for a copy and give it to them. I do that perhaps 5 or 10 times a year. I get a request for one of my papers, usually the book chapters, because most of the papers are available. And yes, I send them a copy because it's in my interest, as I'll talk about in a moment, about why you should do this yourself. So, wrapping up the problems of open access, authors still misunderstand the situation and, to be honest, are lazy. They don't want to do the extra work that this entails because it doesn't give them an immediate feedback and no one's pushing them to do it. This is where mandates matter. Mandates from the funding agency and mandates from the institution. If it becomes a standard part of your work and if they make it easy for you to do it, you're more likely to do it. But it is in your own interests to do it as an academic author. Librarians, as I've mentioned, they don't understand their role has changed and they're often overly restrictive about what goes in archives. They want all the little dots and I's dotted and T's crossed. They've missed the fact that these days, most people find papers through Google Scholar or Microsoft Academic or through some other format, which takes them directly to the papers they want. We don't anymore mostly go through. If I read a paper and I want to look up a reference, I slam the title into Google Scholar. And 9 times out of 10, that gets me there immediately. I don't care anymore about all the minor details. Is it the right page numbers? I don't care. The page numbers may not even be on the open access copy I get access to. I really don't care. So long as I'm sure it's the right paper, that's what matters. So I don't need all these details, but the librarians were trained that all these details matter. And they do to a certain extent, but not for the open access side. There remain real and spurious prestige issues, predatory journals, poor reputations of gold, particularly some gold open access journals. And we have this transfer from cost to read to cost to write, which perpetuates both industrialized and developing economy divides, but also other divides of power within academia. Other issues are used to distract, plagiarism and other academic misconduct. I've had people argue with me that if we make all these papers available this way, we will encourage plagiarism, which is rubbish. Plagiarism happens anyway. Believe me, as somebody who deals on a week-to-week basis with academic plagiarism complaints and other academic misconduct complaints, they happen anyway. It's nothing to do with open access. Electronic access, yes, has probably increased it. It's meant people can copy and paste much more easily. But it's the electronic access, not the open access, that makes a difference there. And scholarly societies remain, in many cases, addicted to publishing income. And the commercial publishers are expecting these massive profits. It's one of the most profitable businesses in the world. The major academic publishers make at least 40%. Let me repeat that, at least 40% profit margins. There are hardly any other industries in the world which regularly return 40% profit margins. And that's even ignoring the fact that a lot of what they spend their money on is all about improving their income, not about improving academic communication. So actually, if we just paid for the necessary bits of academic communication, the current system could cost us a half or less than what it does. And we need to find a fair way of funding that. But we also need to accept that the current system has serious problems in the first place. So why should you be involved in open access and open data? It improves science and scholarship all the way around. If people have access to the right material, their writing will improve, their work will improve. They're less likely to be publishing things which are a duplication of what someone else has done. They're more likely to be able to get the right material into their own work. For you personally, if you make your work open access, you're not restricting access to your writing to those who can pay the publisher for access. And there is very good empirical evidence that improves your citations. This is a Red Queen hypothesis. Other people, like me, are making their work open access. If you're competing with me for readers' attention and for their citations, you're at a disadvantage if you don't make your work open access. And if the vast majority of people in your field aren't making their work open access, then you can steal a march on them by making your work accessible. If somebody can't read it, they're not going to cite it. Well, mostly. I'm sure we all know times where people have cited something secondarily. It was cited by X, therefore I'm citing it. But yes, most of the time, if somebody can't read it, they can't cite it. Open data, as I've said, there are still more problems with open data, but it is also an imperative to improve science and scholarship. It allows replication, which is the poor nephew in science. We need more replication, and one way of allowing that is by opening data. It's not the only prerequisite. We need other ways, other things as well, such as better prestige for doing it. But it's one step we can make ourselves to improving that, is by publishing where we can and where it's reasonable, publishing the data on which our work depends. It allows the development of meta-studies. During the pandemic, we have seen the importance of very fast development of meta-studies on the efficacy of masks for stemming the spread of SARS-CoV-2 virus, of various other forms, and of the treatments, but also the mitigations. We're seeing now the emergence. Just today, I saw a new meta-study about the long-term impacts of even having a mild case of COVID, which is a big debate at the moment, as many governments are seeking to open up and say, well, everybody's vaccinated now, we can let them get it. Even if they get it, it'll be only a mild case. We can treat it like the flu or a cold. But there's some interesting meta-studies coming out now that say, no, actually, it has a long-term effect. It's reducing people's general health. It's limiting people's lifespan. We need these things. Meta-studies are much easier to do if your data is open. We can make the best use of the data globally. And in your own terms, it opens opportunities for collaboration. If somebody can see your data, they can come to you and they can say, oh, I'd like to do this study based on your data. And you can say, oh, yeah, that's great. That's something I haven't had time to do. But can we collaborate on writing the paper after you've done it? And it was your work that went into this originally. And hopefully, if they're being an honest, ethical author, they won't just take your data and run with it. They will talk to you about whether you have time to collaborate with them on the use of the data. And longer term, it opens up. You find people who are working in the same field as you. And even if they don't collaborate on the particular paper, it opens up and improves your network. You know who else is working in exactly the same field. So I've been going on for quite a while. I'm actually going to skip on this. The slides will be available to you on the website as well. The how, I've given you the why. Please look at this on the how. I've talked about much of this already today. Please do read through this. If I've persuaded you, you should be doing it and you aren't already. Please read through the how and follow it yourself. But I do want to leave the time, therefore, to go on to how this ties into openness more generally. Open access and open data are steps on the road to more open science. We need science to be more open. Science has, unfortunately, from its starting point as a very open field, well, an open field for rich men, rich white men, I should say. It has become narrowed and restricted, and we need to open it up. But OA and OD are only two parts of that. The other parts of responsible research and innovation and other parts of science ethics also need engaging with, public engagement, The ethics, not just of how we treat our subjects, of what our processes are, but of what we decide to do research on. These are all part of opening up science, engaging with the public in both the input to what we should be studying, not just what are we interested in studying. And yes, that's a key part of being an academic. It's one of the things that drives most of us as academics is our own curiosity and our own interests. But we should also, in particular where we're receiving public funds, we should ask the public, what problems are they interested in having solved? And then when we've done our work, we should be explaining to the public, who in many cases funded the work, what the outcomes were. And making your work open access is great for other scientists and researchers. It's not so great for the public. Some of them can read it and understand this and gain benefits, but it's not the only thing you need to do in public explanation. You need simpler explanations, précis, general presentations on this material. It doesn't have to be the researcher who did the work themselves or who wrote the paper. Not everybody is suited to doing that work. Not everybody can be trained in doing that work. But the institutions should have a responsibility to make sure there are people, and then working with these people so that your work can be accessed by a broader public is something you should be looking at as well. So don't think that OA is the end result. The only thing you need to do about disseminating the results of your research. It's one stage, but not the only one. Now, much of science and engineering leads eventually to innovation, whether it's basic science and engineering that leads in 30 years, like the piece of pure mathematics about electron spin, which formed the basis of the development of integrated circuits and large-scale integrated circuits. That was a piece of curiosity-driven pure mathematics that the author didn't think had any practical implications, but it meant that when they developed the integrated circuit, they had a 30-year lead time on the pure mathematics that underlay it. Open innovation, by which we don't seek to limit the details of our innovation. We don't seek to control things via trade secrets. We don't seek to control things via patents. We produce what we produce. We innovate. We are first to market in generating that. Hopefully, we can make a return on the investment. And open innovation is good for the economy more broadly. I'm not an economist, but I trust what the economists tell me when they basically say that open innovation drives an expansion of the economy in a solid, sustainable way. But the closed route is still dictated often by greed. I'm always disappointed when publicly funded research and publicly funded research institutions decide to close things down. I really dislike it when universities start scoring staff on how many patents they file. I come out of a very much an open engineering background. When I've worked with engineering people in schools and in research, they want their work out there for anybody else to use. But the universities are often pushing them to file patents on it. Some of them resist that. Sometimes they get seduced themselves by the greed, or they just get pushed into it by the university institutions. Open knowledge, this relates to the public explanation side. If you're an expert in an area, consider doing things like editing the Wikipedia entries in your fields. Wikipedia gets a bad rep in some areas for being very difficult to get involved in and being a hotbed of abuse. It is in some certain areas. I mean, I really wouldn't advise anybody to get into editing the issues of teen sexuality or the Arab-Israeli conflict on Wikipedia. The areas of those on Wikipedia are heavily locked down to approved editors only for very good reasons. But if you look, for example, on the string theory sections on Wikipedia, some of the top string theorists in the world edit the string theory pages of Wikipedia with the latest theories, the latest explanations, and they're constantly adding to it so that ordinary people, albeit smart ordinary people with a background in a reasonable level of maths, you know, if you just have a general maths at what used to be O level in the UK or GED in America or whatever the equivalent in other countries is, No, you're not going to be able to understand the details of string theory. But if you've got an undergraduate degree in a science or some other mathematically oriented field, you're going to be able to understand the Wikipedia entries on string theory, because the best experts in the world at explanation of science and string theory edit those pages. The people who are pushing the boundaries, who may not be good at explanations, edit it with the new theories, and then the people who can understand that and explain that to the public edit it to make it understandable for an informed audience. If your area has Wikipedia entries or doesn't have a Wikipedia entry, think about putting it on there. Wikipedia is one of the most amazing things that has come out of the internet revolution, as far as I'm concerned. Yes, like everything, it has problems, but the vast majority of it, and the science and engineering fields in particular, is really good quality stuff. And it's not a hotbed of abuse or anything like that. If you go in and you learn how it works, the same way you learned how to write an academic journal article, treat it the same. Learn how a Wikipedia article works, learn how and why you should edit, and then introduce the well-accepted parts of your field to the public. Wikipedia is not the right place to put your latest research results, but there are other open access, open knowledge places to put those pieces of work. Yeah, there are other wikis, there are specialist places to put your research on. Your institution may have them, your research council may have them, your country may have them. Find out what these are. Put a little bit of your effort into that, opening up the knowledge to the world. So, my conclusions, particularly going back to open access and open data. Open access and open data is aimed at other researchers and to some extent people in policy. It doesn't replace public understanding and community outreach dissemination, but it is a key element of good science, and it supports good science. It's part of ethical science. If your work can't be read, it's not good science. If only a small portion of the people who could benefit from reading your work are able to access it, it's not the best science you can be doing. And I'm sure all of you want to do the best science and engineering you can when you're doing the work itself. Yeah, I'm sure you don't cut corners in the science and engineering that you do. And then you publish the journal article and then leave it behind a paywall where not everyone can access it. It's part of ethical science to make sure people can read what you write. It lets your work speak for itself to everyone, not only to those who can afford the subscriptions. And on a purely non-altruistic, purely selfish note, it raises your profile. It raises your profile with other researchers. It raises your profile with policy people. And I know the area many of you work in is important for environmental activism, environmental policy. These policy people are a key audience, and many of them have the right background, PhDs or undergrad or master's degrees in these subjects, so they can understand the papers. There may not be people producing the papers themselves, but they can understand them. Another key finding we had from the RRI project was that many policymakers struggle to gain access. They don't always have the funding, particularly if they're in the third sector charity lobbying area or in the think tank area. Now, if they're funded by government, maybe they've got it. But even government funding departments often have limits on what they can pay for subscription access. Beyond yourself, if your institution doesn't have an internal OA mandate and a repository, get involved and lobby for it. The green route is still the best route we've got to making a sustainable development of open access. So I hope you found that interesting and persuading that you should be more engaged with these sorts of things, and that open access, open data is part of open science, open knowledge, and an open society in the end. Thank you very much.